Years ago, Brent and I attended a youth workers conference, and one of the teachers, one of the sessions had been a youth minister and then a college-age young adult minister, and then at that time was a pulpit minister. And someone asked him during a session time, what was your favorite age group to teach? And they were thinking probably high school or college, and he said preschool was my favorite age to teach. And they were, shocked. They were surprised. And I think I may have told you this before, but they asked him, why is that your favorite age group to teach? And he said, because the curriculum is so simple. It's Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And don't bite each other. I mean, that's, and I think sometimes we need to learn those simple lessons, be reinforced in those simple lessons. So this morning, I'm going to start by reading a book from my library, a children's book that's very familiar with most, if not all of you. This is a book by Judith Viorst. It's called Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. So if you'll indulge me in a moment, I'm going to go. It's not a long book, so I'm going to read it all. I went to sleep with gum in my mouth, and now there's gum in my hair. And when I got out of bed this morning, I tripped on the skateboard, and by mistake, I dropped my sweater in the sink while the water was running, and I could tell it was going to be a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. At breakfast, Anthony found a Corvette Stingray car kit in his breakfast cereal box. And Nick found a junior undercover agent code ring in his cereal box. But in my breakfast cereal box, all I found was breakfast cereal. I think I'll move to Australia. In the carpool, Mrs. Gibson let Becky have a seat by the window. Audrey and Elliot got seats by the window too. I said I was being scrunched. I said I was being smashed. I said if I don't get a car seat by the window, I'm going to be car sick. No one even answered. I could tell it was going to be a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. At school, Mrs. Dickens liked Paul's picture of the sailboat better than my picture of the invisible castle. At singing time, she said I sang too loud. At counting time, she said I left out 16. Who needs 16? I could tell it was going to be a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. I could tell because Paul said I wasn't his best friend anymore. He said that Philip Parker was his best friend, and that Albert Moyo was his next best friend, and that I was only his third best friend. I hope you sit on a tack, I said to Paul. I hope the next time you get a double-decker strawberry ice cream cone, the ice cream part falls off the cone part and lands in Australia. There's a theme here. There were 2 cupcakes in Philip Parker's lunch bag, and Albert got a Hershey bar with almonds. And Paul's mother gave him a piece of jelly roll that had little coconut sprinkles on the top. Guess whose mother forgot to put in dessert? It was a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. That's what it was because after school, my mom took us all to the dentist, and Dr. Fields found a cavity just in me. Come back next week and I'll fix it, said Dr. Fields. Next week, I said, I'm going to be in Australia. On the way downstairs, the elevator door closed on my foot, and while we were waiting for my mom to go get the car, Anthony made me fall where it was muddy, and then I started crying because of the mud, and Nick said I was a crybaby, and while I was punching Nick for saying crybaby, my mom came back with the car and scolded me for being muddy and fighting. I'm having a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, I told everybody. No one even answered. So we went to the shoe store to buy some sneakers. Anthony chose white ones with blue stripes. Nick chose red ones with white stripes. I chose blue ones with red stripes. But the shoe man said, we're all sold out. They made me buy plain old white ones, but they can't make me wear them. When we picked up my dad at the office, he said I couldn't play with the copying machine, but I forgot. He also said to watch out for the books on his desk, and I was as careful as could be except for my elbow. He also said don't fool around with his phone, but I think I called Australia. My dad said, please don't pick him up anymore. It was a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. There were lima beans for dinner, and I hate limas. There was kissing on TV, and I hate kissing. My bath was too hot. I got soap in my eyes. My marble went down the drain, and I had to wear my railroad train pajamas. Sorry, Vernon, if you're listening. I hate my railroad train pajamas. When I went to bed, Nick took back the pillow he said I could keep, and the Mickey Mouse night light burned out, and I bit my tongue. The cat wants to sleep with Anthony, not with me. It has been a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. My mom says some days are like that, even in Australia. We have a lot of those kinds of days, don't we, sometimes? It feels like the whole world is against us. And it seems like there's a lot of people having those kinds of days anymore. If you spend much time on the internet looking at the news or watching news on TV or however you get your news, there's a lot of people having terrible, horrible, no good, very bad days. And there's a lot of people doing that to other people. Everywhere we turn, there's violence. There's people hurting one another. There's unpopular wars, political strife, threat of a pandemic. I think the latest warnings are for bird flu and monkey flu. I didn't really know monkey flu was a thing until about a year ago. Natural disasters, we've seen a lot of that lately. Talk of climate change and the temperature going up. The list goes on and on. I have another book in my library. It's a more adult book. It's called Isaac's Storm. And in this storm, it talks about the conditions leading up to and the actual event of the worst natural disaster in United States history in terms of loss of human life. And it happened in 1900. And let me describe some of the storms happening in the world at that time, and maybe it will sound familiar. There was a high-pressure system dominating much of the country, so there was no breeze. There was an unprecedented heat wave across much of the country. On Saturday, August 11th of that year, the temperature in Philadelphia reached nearly 102 degrees. Of course, there was no air conditioning at that time. The same day in New York City, 30 people died from heat prostration. 3 children died after they fell from fire escapes where they had gone to try to find some breeze. There was no breeze. The Boxer Rebellion was going on in China. There were a bunch of Chinese nationalists trying to push all the foreigners out of China. And there were some military, U.S. military troops stationed there, and there were U.S. warships steaming towards China to support those troops. The Boer War was happening in Africa, and it was becoming increasingly unpopular in Great Britain. They had an incident where Boer snipers fired at a British troop train. And in response, the commanding general ordered every house within 10 miles to be burned to the ground. News got back to London, and there was shock. There was protests calling for action to be taken against that. A madman assassinated Italy's King Humbert. Another assassin tried to kill the Shah of Persia in Paris. Bubonic plague was turned up in London and Glasgow, Great Britain. And it was a presidential election year in the United States. And if you think things are polarized today, go back and read some of the stuff that was going on in the politics in the early 1900s. Things were no different, may have been even a little worse then. But all that sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Doesn't it sound a lot familiar as to the news headlines that we see today? And in the highlands of Africa, a butterfly flapped its wings. Chaos theory, one of the part of chaos theory said if a butterfly flaps its wing in Africa and the breeze goes to the right of the tree, there'll only be a tropical depression. If it goes to the left of the tree, there'll be a hurricane. The winds raced down the mountains and collided with the super hot air over the Sahara Desert, then swept towards the Atlantic. A deadly storm was brewing. Isaac Klein, who the title of this book is Isaac Storm, and he's one of the main characters, a real person that it was written about, was the head of the Texas section of the U.S. Weather Bureau in Galveston, Texas. He took a lot of pride in his job. As a matter of fact, someone wrote that he was one of the hardest workers that he'd ever seen in the division. It's funny, the interesting thing about that, the U.S. Weather Bureau at that time was part of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, which I found interesting. But it also, there was a lot of bureaucracy involved. The bureaucrats in Washington wanted to control every aspect of this. And so they often, or more often than not, didn't cooperate with weather forecasters in other countries, particularly in Cuba. There was a real friction there. But one of the things there is that the bureaucrats in Washington had for several years banned the use of the word tornado in forecasting or reporting on storms because they were afraid it would cause a panic. And they didn't. A panic wasn't a good thing politically. This storm that started in Africa as strong winds and moved over into the cooler air over the Atlantic and gathered moisture became a very strong storm and hit Cuba. And the Cuban forecasters notified their U.S. counterparts and said, "Hey, this storm is heading straight towards East Texas. It's going to we estimate it's going to make landfall in Galveston, Texas." But the U.S. Weather Bureau refused to believe that because everyone knew that hurricanes, when they hit the Gulf of Mexico, changed course and went northeasterly up the eastern seaboard of the United States. And that's what was going to happen in this case. This one would not. So all the forecasters along the Gulf Coast were ordered, especially towards the more western part of the Gulf Coast, were ordered not to issue storm warnings without approval. Isaac could not issue a storm warning even though the conditions that he saw told him something was going on. So on Saturday, September 8th of 1900, there were extraordinarily high waves hitting the beaches in Galveston. People flocked down to the beach to see this. The tide was abnormally high, and some of the streets were flooding, and children took wash basins and wash buckets or the wash tubs, and they were floating down the streets in boats. Everyone was having a grand time. The waves got higher, the wind got stronger, and finally it was too late to issue the storm warning. The storm was on them. People fled from the beach seeking shelter. Unfortunately, if you know anything about Galveston at that time was built at only 8.7 feet above sea level, the highest point. Most homes at that time were not built on stilts. Some were. Most were not. The ground there was sandy. You had to go pretty deep to find some shale to give you a stable foundation. So over the next few hours, people desperately looked for shelter. At times, people would see a building or a home standing, and 30 or 40 would crowd into it, only to be swept away. There were very few places that they could find shelter. Many would not. At least, for sure, 6,000 men, women, and children died during that storm. Many placed the toll closer to 10,000. Because of the lack of facilities and everything, they weren't allowed to properly take care of the dead. And so many were burned on the beach, and they had bonfires. Of going on the beach to burn the bodies. Isaac Klein always felt a sense of responsibility. His brother also worked there in the Weather Service, and his brother had urged him to issue a warning, but Isaac refused because he had been told not to. After that, he and his brother never spoke again. Livelihoods, homes, relationships were lost. Isaac Klein's own wife, who was pregnant with their child, died in that storm. There was no place of safety for most of the people there. They couldn't find it. Have you ever experienced storms in your life? Well, yeah, we all have, haven't we? Those times when things just didn't make sense. Sometimes our problems are small and easily remedied, and we feel like we're in control, but many times they're so big and our faith seems so small. Times when we feel swamped and so afraid that we're going to be overtaken by the storm and the chaos. I know I've felt like that at times in my life with health issues, with loss of job, with other things going on. And I was just overtaken by the things around me. Peter tells us in 1 Peter that that's going to happen. He said, 1 Peter 4:12, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." Jesus in John chapter 16 says the same thing. I'm sorry, John chapter 13. Let me get my notes. Like I say, I've rewritten this. John chapter 16, "You believe at last," Jesus answered, "but a time is coming and has come when you will be scattered, each to his own home. You will leave me all alone, yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Storms will come. It's not a matter of if, but only when. Maybe you lose your job. A family member has a serious accident or a serious health issue. Or, as we've seen in our area recently, a tornado rips through our community. You can fill in your own personal storm because the list goes on and on. Maybe there's a relationship that has turned out upside down. Things don't go as you plan. Jesus tells us to not be surprised at that. Those things are going to happen. But I think we have to think about, where do these storms come from in our lives? Sometimes storms come from our own rebellion and disobedience. I think about Jonah. This is a story that all the children know. We learn as children in Bible class. But you look at Jonah chapter 1, Jonah found himself in a storm of his own making, of his own rebellion. He was going to prove to God that he was not going to go to Nineveh, so he ran away. Verses 3 through 5 of chapter 1 tells us Jonah went down to Joppa, and then he went down to the dock and got on a ship. And when the storm came, he went down into the bottom of the ship. When the sailors realized it was Jonah who was causing the storm, they threw him into the ocean. It was his own rebellion that brought on that. James 1:14 says, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires." Our rebellion often comes from us being, taking our eyes off the prize. We're going to talk about that some more in a minute, but we see the things in the earth of the world offering more hope, more safety, more security. We become dependent on our own strengths, our own abilities, our own wisdom, and take our focus off of God and off of Christ. Psalm 78, starting with verse 53, talks about this when the psalmist is describing the Israelites leaving Egypt. It Starting in verse 53 of Psalm 78, he led them in safety so that they were not afraid, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. And he brought them to his holy land, to the mountain, which is right-handed one. He drove out nations before them. He apportioned them for a possession and settled the tribes of Israel in their tents. Yet they tested and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies, but turned away and acted treacherously like their fathers. They twisted like a deceitful bow, for they provoked him to anger with their high places. They moved him to jealousy with their idols. When God heard, he was full of wrath, and he utterly rejected Israel. He forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, his tent where he dwelt among mankind, and delivered his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. He gave his people over to the sword and vented his wrath on his heritage. Fire devoured their young men, and their young women had no marriage song. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. In spite of all that God had done for them, in spite of all of the power that he had demonstrated to them, and leading them out of Egypt, the 10 plagues that they witnessed while they were there, defeating the gods of Egypt and parting the Red Sea, feeding them, leading them, being with them, they turned away and they rebelled against God. They became distracted by the things of the world. They look around and saw their neighboring countries worshiping idols and saying, maybe we should do that. Maybe that's better. The result was chaos and destruction. The result was a storm in their life. So sometimes our storms are caused by our own rebellion, our own sin. Sometimes that can cause storms in other people's lives, and sometimes storms are caused by others in our lives. Just like Jonah brought the storm onto the passengers and crew of that ship, people around us can also cause the storm that we're facing right now. The people on the ship were innocent, but they were caught up in Jonah's storm. And you may not have done a thing wrong, but someone around you is rebelling, and now you can get caught in that. We see that happening in relationships all the time, don't we? One partner decides that he or she's going to follow another path. So they break their vows, and they turn away. And look at all of the people that are affected by that. We see that in jobs where an official high up in the company, or more than one sometimes, embezzles money or breaks the law. And in the end, many people lose their jobs. Many people are affected by the fallout of that. We especially see that in politics, where bad decisions are made, and whole nations are affected by that. And you think about that back into the Old Testament, Joshua chapter 7, when the Israelites were going into Canaan, the land of Canaan, and taking the land that God had promised them, and they had won battle after battle after battle until suddenly they didn't, and they couldn't figure out why. This is that Ai. And so God told them that someone had sinned, that there was sin in the camp, and they needed to move it out. So in Joshua 7, verse 18, they brought near his household man by man, and Achan, the son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, the son of Zara, of the tribe of Judah, was taken. And then Joshua said to Achan, "My son, give glory to the Lord God of Israel, and praise him. And tell me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me." And Achan answered Joshua, "Truly I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful cloak from Shinar and 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them, and see, they are hidden in the earth inside my tent with the silver underneath." The Israelites were ordered to take no spoil from the battles, to not keep anything. And one person did that, and it affected the whole nation. brought a storm on them all. And so sometimes our storms, the chaos in our life is caused by our own rebellion, sometimes by the sin, the actions of others. But I think most come simply because we live in a fallen world. Kyle has often described the word shalom, describing how everything was perfected at creation. God stood back and said, man, it's all good. This is good. This is good. And after man was created, he said, this is very good. It was perfect. Everything worked like it was supposed to. But then somebody decided to disobey God. A choice was made. And the real world is where we live now. This real world is no longer an all-good place. It's no longer that place of perfection. It's broken. It's fallen. It's imperfect now and flawed. And the presence of evil is everywhere in our culture. And because of that, we live with sin and all that goes with it, including death. Romans chapter 3, Paul talks about that. And he says, no one is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks God. And he goes on down in verse 20 or 21. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We all live in this imperfect world. We're all affected with the storms. And the trouble with storms is we can't control them. I know there's been a lot of talk, conspiracy theory, and I don't know how true it is or not. I'm not going to go there, but about how some countries may have developed a weapon that can control the weather. And they're using that to create chaos in other countries. I don't think that's true, because that would remove God from that picture. And God is the supreme being of the universe. He is the sovereign Lord of the universe, and He is in control of all things. But we can't control storms. A lot of times the things that go on in our lives, we can't control. We can only find shelter from them. We can try to avoid them, but they're still going to find us. In Galveston, September 8th, 1900, many people lost their lives because they couldn't find shelter, or because they found shelter, took shelter in the wrong place. They thought the shelter that they had taken was going to protect them. But there were instances where 30 to 40 people were found in a house, all deceased, where they had gone in together to take shelter, and then that building was swept away. So many people today look for a place of shelter in the wrong place. We have people that demand that politicians fix everything. They place their hope in science. Science is going to take care of this. We're going to fix the climate, get the climate stable, and we're going to take care of all of these other things through science. Or they put their trust in their wealth or their position to shield them from life's storm. But the only true refuge is in God. God's people, followers of Christ, need to put their faith in the one who can truly shelter, who can truly protect. My son-in-law recently shared this. He's reading a book called Practicing the Way. It's by John Mark Comer. And this quote in the introduction, I think, can be taken a lot of ways to direct our paths. For those of us who desire to follow Jesus, he says, here is the reality we must turn and face. If we're not being intentionally formed by Jesus himself, then it's highly likely we are being unintentionally formed by someone or something else. Let me read that again. If we're not being intentionally formed by Jesus himself, then it's highly likely we are being unintentionally formed or by someone or something else. And I think he could change some different words in there and saying, if we're not intentionally trusting Jesus himself, then it's highly likely that we're going to be unintentionally trusting someone or something else. And the question is, who or what are we turning to when the storms of life are raging around us? Who or what are we being formed by? God is the one that we need to be putting our trust in. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be involved in politics or love science. I love science. I think we all should be involved in politics. But it means that we shouldn't trust in those things to take care of the storms in our lives. We need to depend on God to provide what we need. In times of storms, he gives us rest in the midst of our trials. He gives us courage in the face of terror. He protects us in the midst of danger. He saves us from the evil that is within and without. It is to him we must trust. And one of the ways that God provides that, I think, is the second thing here, is we need to trust and take shelter in each other. John chapter 13, there's the famous story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And that's been taken a lot of different ways. I've often heard it said that this is telling us that we need to be out there washing people's feet, serving other people, doing those things in the community. And I think it can be applied to that. But I don't think that's what Jesus was meaning when he said that. You know, after he said, "Do you understand what I have done for you?" This is in verse 12. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done." And I think what Jesus was doing here, this is right before the end of his life, he was telling his disciples they needed to take care of one another. Here's an interesting thing, and please don't take this the wrong way, but there are more scriptures in the New Testament about how we deal with one another, about how we treat one another, than there is about evangelism. Now, I'm not saying evangelism is not important. It is. But there are more scriptures about how we live together as Christians than there is about that the topic of evangelism. It's important how we deal with one another. Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. "You, my brothers, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love. The entire law is summed up in a single command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you keep on biting and devouring each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other." There's an admonition to love one another, to take care of one another. And he says this is the single command that is the center of the law. But if we don't do that, if we do the opposite, we'll be destroyed by each other. The storms of life will overtake us. So, what storms are you in the middle of today? Are the winds overpowering you? Are the storm clouds blotting out the light? Do you feel helpless to change it? Today is a day we can find peace. We have the warning. We know that there are going to be storms. We know that there is going to be chaos and turbulence and all of those things in our life. Relationships are going to blow up. People are going to disappoint us. People are going to hurt us. Those things are going to happen in our life. Today is a day we can find peace. We can encourage one another. And so we're in a moment we're going to stand and we're going to sing a song. And if we can help in any way with anything that you're struggling with any storms that you're experiencing in your life, you can reach out to one of our elders who will be standing in the back. Or if you're ready to put on Christ in baptism, everything is ready for that. And we would love to help you with that. So I'm going to read Psalm 46, a few passages, and then we're going to stand and sing. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress.